I need to tell you something before we go any further. What I saw when I opened my best friend's bedroom door without knocking. I have thought about it every single day since. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way I can easily explain to anyone who wasn't there. Just quietly, in the back of my head, like a song you can't stop hearing even when you're trying to focus on something else. But if I told you what I saw right now, it wouldn't land the way it needs to. You wouldn't feel the weight of it. So let me take you back to where this actually started, because that door is only the ending. The real story begins way before that. My name is Alex Connor, 28 years old, graphic designer at a mid-sized creative agency in Denver, Colorado. If you looked at my life from the outside, you would probably think it looked fine. Decent salary. A used Honda I had cleaned so many times it looked almost new. I had friends. I went out. I laughed at things. I had a life that looked, from any reasonable angle, like a life. But nothing got in. Nothing really reached me. Then my lease ended. Denver had been getting more expensive every year for as long as I could remember. But that particular year it jumped in a way that felt less like a market shift and more like a direct personal insult. My old building got sold. The new management company raised rents to something that made my stomach hurt every time I looked at my bank account. Here is where I need to tell you about Olivia Cooper. Olivia was my best friend. Had been for almost 4 years, since we ended up at the same small going-away party for a mutual coworker and spent most of the night standing near the snacks talking about everything except the person the party was for. She was 30 years old, a freelance illustrator who worked from home and had built a quiet but growing reputation for her work. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and within 20 minutes know which 3 of them were the most interesting people there. Sharp, warm, funny in a way that didn't try too hard. One of maybe 2 people in the world I had never felt the need to perform for. She had a 2-bedroom apartment in a building called Ridgemont on the quieter edge of the city. 4th floor, good windows, a small balcony she had covered in plants. Her previous roommate had moved out 3 months earlier to go live with a long-term partner, and the second room had been sitting empty since. She had mentioned twice, casually, that she wasn't in a rush to fill it but also wasn't loving the extra cost. I had nodded both times and filed it away without acting on it, because the idea of living with Olivia had always felt like something that existed in the category of things that sound nice until you think about them too long. But now I was thinking about them. I called her on a Tuesday evening and laid out the situation honestly. The rent, the timing, the fact that I had looked at 3 other listings and none of them felt right. She was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then she said, obviously. Come look at the room this weekend and we'll figure it out. I went that Saturday morning carrying a bag of groceries I had picked up on the way over, because showing up empty-handed felt wrong and I wasn't sure what else to bring. She opened the door in paint-stained overalls and a gray long-sleeve shirt and immediately looked at the grocery bag and said, "You didn't have to do that." I said I didn't know what else to bring. She said, "That's actually kind of sweet," and stepped back to let me in. The apartment looked exactly like Olivia. Plants on every windowsill. Illustrations pinned to the walls in various stages of completion. Books everywhere, not organized by any system I could identify but clearly loved. A coffee mug on the kitchen table that said "Do not talk to me" in large block letters. Light coming through the west windows in long warm rectangles that made the whole space feel like late afternoon even at 10 in the morning. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for what was supposed to be 30 minutes about logistics and house rules and schedules. It went almost 3 hours. Not because we were negotiating anything complicated, but because we kept getting sidetracked by actual conversation the way we always did, the way we always had, the way I had never fully appreciated until I was sitting across from her in her kitchen thinking about the fact that I was about to wake up in the same building as this person every single day. She offered me the room before I left. I said yes without hesitating. She looked faintly surprised at how fast I answered. I told her it was because the room was a great size and the location was perfect. Both of those things were completely true. Neither of them was the reason I said yes so fast. I moved in 2 weekends later on a cold Saturday in November, carrying boxes up 4 flights of stairs while Denver hummed around me in that particular gray way it gets in early winter, just before the first real snow. Olivia helped carry the last 3 boxes without being asked. She just appeared at the top of the stairs, took the heaviest one out of my arms like it was obvious, and walked it to my room without making a thing of it. That was the first real thing I noticed about her. Not the way she looked or the way she talked or any of the things I had already known for 4 years. The first thing I noticed, living with her, was that she helped without turning it into a moment. She saw something that needed doing and she did it. No announcement. No expectation of acknowledgement. I told myself that observation meant nothing. Standing in my new room, surrounded by half-opened boxes in the gray November light, I was already wrong about that. And somewhere in the back of my mind, behind the wall I had spent 2 years building, something very small and very quiet was paying close attention. Now I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part where things start to get complicated in ways I was nowhere near prepared for. By the time December arrived, I had been living with Olivia for about 5 weeks. And I want to be very precise about what I am about to tell you, because I need you to understand that nothing dramatic had happened. There was no single moment I could point to, no conversation that flipped a switch. Just 5 weeks of ordinary daily life that had quietly done more damage to my carefully maintained wall than 2 years of keeping everyone at a comfortable distance had managed to protect. Here is what nobody tells you about living with someone you already care about as a friend. You think you know them. You have years of evidence, shared history, inside jokes. You have seen them at their best and probably at a few of their not best moments too. You feel like you have a complete picture. But friendship, even close friendship, always has an exit built into it. Every time you hang out, you eventually go home. You go back to your separate life. You get to keep a version of that person that is, without either of you meaning it to be, slightly curated. Living with someone removes the exit. You see them before they have had coffee and are ready to be a person. You hear the music they listen to when they think no one is paying attention. You notice that they talk quietly to their plants when they think the apartment is empty. You see how they handle a frustrating phone call, or a project that isn't working, or a day that has just ground them down. You see the parts that don't make it into the highlight reel. And if you already cared about that person before you moved in, those parts don't push you away. They do something much more inconvenient than that. Now, let me ask you something while we're here. Where in the world are you listening to this story right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're finding yourself hooked on this, hit subscribe because I have more stories coming that you do not want to miss. I learned things about Olivia those first weeks that no amount of friendship had ever taught me. I learned that she woke up every morning at 6:15 without an alarm, made tea with the focused attention of someone performing a delicate procedure, and did not speak a full sentence to anyone until the first cup was finished. I learned that she worked in intense concentrated bursts, completely absorbed, then suddenly needed to do something completely physical, like reorganize a shelf or rearrange the plants on the balcony, before she could go back to the desk. I learned that she cooked without measuring anything, adjusting entirely by smell and taste and some internal calibration I could not follow, and that everything she made was somehow exactly right. I learned that she laughed with her whole face, not just her mouth, her eyes, her shoulders, everything. And I learned, earlier than was probably wise, that she had 2 completely different laughs. One for things that were mildly amusing. One for things that genuinely caught her off guard and reached something real. The polite laugh was warm. The real laugh was something else entirely. Without planning it or deciding to, I had started angling for the real one. That was the moment, looking back now, when I should have recognized what was happening and made a different choice. I did not make a different choice. I kept cooking dinner and leaving space in conversations and learning the rhythms of her day and telling myself it was just what it looked like to be a good roommate and a good friend. I was so convincing that I almost believed it myself. Then, on a Friday evening in the second week of December, I came home from work to find a man I had never met sitting at our kitchen table. He was tall, easy in his body in the way that some people just are, like the world is a room they have always been comfortable in. Dark hair, relaxed posture, the kind of face that reads as both interesting and unthreatening. He was leaning forward on his elbows talking to Olivia when I came through the door, and they both looked up at the same time. Olivia smiled. "Hey, you're home. This is Daniel." Daniel stood up and shook my hand with the kind of easy confidence that makes you like someone against your better judgment. He said it was great to meet me, that Olivia had mentioned me. He stayed for another hour, easy and friendly and impossible to dislike, and then he left with a hug at the door that lasted 1 second longer than a casual hug usually does. I stood in the kitchen after she closed the door and asked, very casually, who Daniel was. She picked up her mug and said, just as casually, that he was an old friend. Then she went back to her desk. I put my bag down. I opened the refrigerator. I stared at its contents for about 30 seconds without actually seeing anything. I had heard the word friend used in that exact tone before, in that exact casual way that is doing a lot of heavy lifting in a very short sentence. And something in the pit of my stomach, something I had spent 5 weeks trying to ignore, got very loud very fast. I closed the refrigerator. I made something for dinner. I was friendly and easy all through the evening, the way I always was. But the wall I had spent 2 years maintaining had just developed a crack I could no longer pretend wasn't there. And Daniel, whoever he really was to Olivia, was about to make that crack a whole lot wider. I found out who he really was 3 days later, not because Olivia told me, but because I overheard a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I had come home early from work on a Monday afternoon, a headache that had started around 2 and built steadily until I gave up and left. The apartment was quiet when I came in. I assumed Olivia was at her studio, which she rented a few blocks away for larger projects. I dropped my bag, went to the kitchen to get water, and heard her voice coming quietly from behind her partially closed bedroom door. She wasn't talking loudly, but the walls in that apartment were not thick and I was standing right there and I heard enough. I heard her say his name. I heard her say that she didn't know what she wanted. I heard her say that what happened between them had taken a long time to stop affecting her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to revisit it. I heard her voice do something I had never heard it do before, something careful and slightly unsteady, like someone walking across ice they're not sure will hold. I filled my glass of water and went to my room and closed the door very quietly. Daniel was not an old friend. Daniel was something much more complicated than that, and he was clearly not done with Olivia. And Olivia, from the sound of that phone call, was not entirely sure what she was done with either. I sat on the edge of my bed and did what I had trained myself to do for 2 years. I pulled back. I built the wall back up, brick by careful brick. I told myself this was none of my business. I told myself I was her roommate and her friend and nothing else, and that whatever was happening with Daniel was her story to navigate, not mine to insert myself into. I told myself all of that with complete conviction. And then I went to make dinner in the kitchen, and when she came out of her room 20 minutes later and asked how my day was, I said fine and smiled and meant none of it. This is where I made the mistake that started everything unraveling. I did not just pull back quietly. I pulled back in a way that Olivia, who noticed everything, was going to clock within days. And when she did, the conversation that followed was going to open a door I had spent 2 years trying to pretend didn't exist. And behind another door entirely, the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this story, something was waiting that I was nowhere near ready to see. We were 5 weeks in. We were just getting started. And the thing I saw behind that door was going to rewrite everything I thought I knew about Olivia Cooper, about myself, and about what it actually means to show up for someone when it costs you something real. The pulling back started on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had eaten dinner in my room 3 nights in a row. I had started leaving for work before Olivia came out of her room in the morning, which meant skipping the part of the day I had quietly started looking forward to the most. That first hour in the kitchen, her with her tea, me with coffee, not even talking much, just being in the same space while the day started. I started keeping my door closed more. When she knocked to ask if I wanted to watch something in the evenings, I said I had work to catch up on. I was never rude about it. I was never cold. I was just absent in that particular way that is hard to call out directly because on the surface everything still looks fine. It was the same move I had made with Claire 2 years earlier, without even recognizing I was running the same play. Olivia noticed on Saturday morning. 5 days. That was all it took. She knocked on my door at 10 in the morning. I was at my desk pretending to work on a project that I had not actually touched in 45 minutes. I said, "Come in." She opened the door and leaned against the frame with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly to one side. And she looked at me with the particular expression she used when she was looking at a drawing that wasn't doing what she wanted it to do. "You've gone somewhere," she said. "I'm right here," I said.
No.
She said it quietly but without any hesitation. You're being careful with me. That's a different thing. I opened my mouth. I had a response ready, something smooth and deflecting, something that would sound reasonable and keep everything safely on the surface. She shook her head very slightly before I got a single word out. Don't, she said. I know what you sound like when you're actually fine. This isn't that. The thing about being called out by someone who genuinely knows you is that all the usual exits close at once. Every carefully prepared deflection lands flat because the person across from you has already seen through it. It is one of the most uncomfortable feelings in the world. It is also, if you are paying attention, one of the most valuable things another person can offer you. I put down the pen I had been holding. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she told me that Daniel was not what I was reading it as. That whatever was between them was history, something painful and complicated that she was still figuring out how she felt about, but not something current. Not something that was moving forward. And I felt a relief so immediate and so complete that it scared me. Because the relief made it impossible to keep pretending I had been pulling back for neutral, sensible, roommate-appropriate reasons. She saw it on my face. I know she did because for just a fraction of a second something shifted in her expression too. Then she pushed off the doorframe, said she was making tea if I wanted some, and walked back down the hall like she hadn't just quietly dismantled 18 months of careful self-protection in under 4 minutes. I sat at my desk for a long time after that. I thought about what she had said. I thought about the relief. I thought about the fact that the relief told me something I had been refusing to look at directly for 5 weeks. And I thought about the fact that Olivia Cooper, my best friend, my roommate, the person I shared a kitchen and a hallway and a balcony full of plants with, was standing somewhere in that apartment right now making tea and probably also thinking about something she wasn't quite ready to say out loud either. I did not go get tea that morning. I wish I had. But I didn't. Instead, I made a decision that I told myself was about protecting the friendship and protecting the living situation and being mature about something that had the potential to get very messy. I decided to keep the feelings where they were and not do anything about them. I decided the responsible thing, the smart thing, the adult thing was to leave it alone. I was so certain I was making the right call. I was so completely, thoroughly wrong. The following Saturday started like any other. Olivia had been at her studio since early morning. I had slept in, gone for a run, made eggs, cleaned up. The apartment was quiet in the particular Saturday morning way that feels different from weekday quiet, slower and more open, like the day hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. I walked down the hall just after 9 to ask if she wanted anything from the corner store before I headed out. I didn't knock. I don't even know why. Habit, maybe. Comfort. The stupid confidence you get after weeks of shared space, like the normal rules don't apply to you anymore. I pushed the door open, and I froze. Olivia was sitting on the floor with her back against her bed and her knees pulled up to her chest. There was a piece of paper in her hands. Her eyes were wet. She had been crying, not the loud kind, not the kind that fills a room with noise, but the quiet kind. The kind that happens when something heavy has been held for too long and there is simply no strength left to hold it. I forgot entirely why I had come down the hall in the first place. She looked up at me and did not look embarrassed. She did not wave me away or reach up to wipe her face or do any of the things people do when they have been caught feeling something they didn't plan to show. She just looked at me with those eyes that were not 3 steps ahead of anyone right now, that were right here, right now, completely unguarded. And she said, very quietly, "Close the door." I stepped inside. I pulled the door closed behind me, and I sat down on the floor across from her because standing above someone who is hurting on the floor of their own room felt like the wrong thing to do. I didn't say anything. I had learned enough about Olivia by then to know that she would speak when she was ready, that pushing would close her off faster than silence ever would. So I just sat there and I waited and I let the room be quiet. She looked down at the paper in her hands. It was a letter from a creative director at a publishing house in New York. They had found her illustration portfolio through a gallery contact and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration on a children's book series. It was the kind of professional recognition she had been working toward for years, the kind of thing that arrives quietly in an envelope and means that all the early mornings and the uncertain stretches and the years of building something in near silence had actually added up to something someone else could see. And it had broken her open completely. Not because it was bad news. but because it had arrived on the same night that Daniel had called to tell her he wanted to try again, that he had extended his stay in Denver, that the reason he had extended it was her, and she had spent the entire night alone in her room sitting with both of those things, not knowing what she felt about either of them, until the weight of it had finally become too much to carry standing up. I looked at her sitting on the floor of her room in the gray December light, holding a letter that proved her work mattered, crying quietly because matching is sometimes more overwhelming than being ignored, and I felt something inside me go very still. Not the careful stillness I had been practicing for 2 years. A different kind. The kind that arrives when you are finally, genuinely paying attention to someone other than yourself. I said, "That letter is extraordinary, Olivia." She looked up. "Not just because of what it says," I said. "Because of what it means you've been doing all this time without anyone making enough noise about it." She stared at me for a second. Then her face did something complicated and she looked back down at the letter. "Daniel wants to try again," she said. "I know," I said. "I heard part of your phone call. I wasn't trying to."
I'm sorry.
She shook her head slowly. "He's not a bad person. He never was. He just had this idea of who I was and kept loving that version even when I was trying to show him a different one. And after a while, I couldn't tell anymore which version was real." She stopped, looked at the wall. "That's a terrible feeling." "I know what that feels like," I said. She looked at me, and I told her. Not the smooth, vague version I had given her during our first conversation at the kitchen table. The real version. About Claire. About spending an entire relationship performing the most presentable, least complicated version of myself until I lost track of what was underneath it. About the 2 years afterward of keeping everyone at a careful, manageable distance and calling it having good boundaries when actually it was just fear with better marketing. When I finished, Olivia was quiet for a moment. She was looking at me in a way she had not looked at me before. Not evaluating. Not 3 steps ahead. Just present. "I've been doing the same thing," she said quietly. "But mine goes inward. I throw everything into the work because the work doesn't ask me to be anything other than honest. People are harder." She paused. "You can't put people in a kiln and see if they hold." I looked at her. "No," I said. "You can't." We sat on the floor of her room for nearly 2 hours. Not fixing anything. Not solving anything. Just talking the way we had talked in the kitchen on 100 ordinary evenings, except without any of the performance, without either of us managing what the other person would think. It was the most honest conversation I had ever had with another human being. And it was happening on the floor of her bedroom in December, while a letter from New York sat between us and Daniel's name hung somewhere in the air above us unanswered. When I finally stood up to leave, we were both quieter than when we had started. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of things going unsaid. The quiet of things that had finally been said and were now settling into the space between us, finding where they fit. At the door I stopped and looked back at her. "Whatever you decide about Daniel," I said, "just make sure it's what you actually want. Not what feels safest. Not what avoids the most discomfort. What you actually want." She looked at me steadily. "When did you get wise?" "I've always been this wise," I said. "I just keep it very well hidden." She laughed. The real one. Whole face. Completely unguarded. Filling the room. I went to the corner store. I walked every aisle once and stood in front of the refrigerator section for a full 2 minutes before I remembered what I had gone in there for. I bought the things I needed. I walked back in the cold Denver air and felt like every part of my body was more awake than it had been in years. When I got home, her door was closed. I could hear her voice inside, quiet and steady. She was on the phone. I went to my room. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop, and I started writing not because I had planned to, but because there was too much in my chest to hold still, and writing was the only way I knew how to set something down without losing it. I wrote for almost 2 hours. I wrote about the first morning I stood in the kitchen doorway watching her make tea and felt something shift without knowing yet what it was. I wrote about the 2 laughs and which one I had started trying to earn. I wrote about the floor of her room and the letter and the 2 hours of the most honest conversation of my life. I wrote things I had not let myself think clearly until they were in sentences in front of me. I wrote, "I do not know what this is yet, but the apartment is different when you are not in it. And I have not felt this awake in years. And I am done pretending that means nothing." I saved the document. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I did not close the laptop correctly. And that small, careless mistake, the screen going dark without the document closing, was about to make a decision for me that I had been too afraid to make for myself. The next morning, Olivia knocked on my door at 7:45. I opened it still mostly asleep, expecting something ordinary, a question about the grocery list, a heads up about the building's water being shut off, something simple. She was standing in the hallway holding 2 mugs of tea. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 4 years of friendship. Not the evaluating look. Not the whole-face laugh. Something quieter and more open than either of those, and underneath it, something that looked a little bit afraid. "Your door was open a little," she said. "I was going to leave tea on your desk. I wasn't trying to read it. But your laptop screen was on and the document was full-screened and I only read the first 3 lines before I stopped. Every single thing inside me went completely still. How much is 3 lines? I asked. Enough, she said. I leaned against the doorframe because my legs had made a unilateral decision to be unreliable. Olivia, let me go first, she said. Please. I stopped. She looked down at the mugs for a moment, then back up at me. I told Daniel no last night, she said. Not because I had to, because it was true. Because somewhere between November and right now, the thing I kept coming home wanting at the end of every day was not his company. She paused. It was yours, not as a friend. As something I didn't have a name for yet because naming it felt like standing at the edge of something very high and I wasn't sure the ground would hold. She stopped, held my gaze. But I've been careful for long enough that it started to feel dishonest. And the one thing I have never been willing to be is dishonest. I stood in the doorway of my room in the early morning light looking at my best friend saying the most precisely honest thing anyone had ever said to me, and I felt something come loose that had been held tight for a very long time. Not breaking loose, just releasing, the way a breath releases when you have been holding it without realizing. I reached out and gently took both mugs from her hands and set them on the table beside my door. She watched me do it. I left the laptop open, I said. She tilted her head slightly. I closed it wrong, but I have been leaving doors open for weeks. On purpose without admitting it was on purpose. Hoping you would walk through one of them. She stared at me. That is either the most honest thing I have ever heard or a complete accident that you are taking credit for. Probably both, I said. She laughed. The real one. It moved through the whole apartment and made the gray December morning feel warmer than it had any right to feel. I took one step toward her. She did not step back. And the distance that I had spent months carefully maintaining, that I had built and defended and told myself was wise and protective and the right thing, closed in a way that felt less like a decision and more like the end of an argument I had already lost a long time ago and just hadn't admitted yet. What came after that morning belongs to us. What I will tell you is this. We spent that entire Sunday in the apartment. We made breakfast slowly and ate it at the kitchen table and talked without performing anything for each other, without managing what the other person would think. She showed me 3 new illustrations she had been afraid to show anyone, including the ones she was submitting to the publishing house. I told her about a creative project at work I had been sitting on for months because I didn't trust my own instincts enough to pitch it. She listened and said 4 sentences that made me see the whole thing clearly for the first time. By evening we were on the couch, her feet tucked under my leg, neither of us fully watching the film that was playing, and the apartment felt like the warmest place in the city. Weeks passed, then months. She took the book collaboration and it became the most important work of her career. I pitched the project at work and my creative director called it the strongest concept I had brought in since joining the agency. We got a small succulent for the kitchen counter. No history, nothing inherited from anyone else. Just something we chose together on an ordinary Wednesday because it felt right. One evening in late spring, she asked what I would have done if she hadn't walked into my room that morning. I thought about it honestly. I would have kept leaving doors open, I said. Until you walked through one. She rested her head on my shoulder. Good thing I needed to return your charger, she said. Outside, Denver was cold and bright and alive. Inside, everything was exactly right. And the thing I know now that I did not know then is that the most important moments in your life almost never arrive with any announcement. They knock quietly, they wait, and the only thing that determines what happens next is whether you are finally willing to stop pretending you don't hear them. It all started because I walked into my best friend's room without knocking. And what I saw behind that door froze me in place. Not because it was scandalous or shocking, but because it was real. It was her, alone, hurting, and unguarded. And it was the beginning of the most honest chapter of my life. If the story reached you somewhere real, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories coming that I think you are going to want to hear. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are listening to this right now. I read every single one, and that small thing, knowing where you are, reminds me why these stories are worth telling.